In Wyoming, in the dead of winter, sound carries far. And some sounds you learn to recognize before you can name them. She set down the axe. She did not go inside for her coat. She had been waiting for this moment longer than anyone in that yard could know. And she was ready.
The wind came down from the mountains like a living thing, mean and purposeful, scouring the single dirt street of Redemption, Wyoming, of any warmth it might have briefly held. It was the kind of cold that settled into a person's bones and stayed there, that made every breath feel like swallowing broken glass. Nora Hargrove felt it in her hands, clenched inside leather gloves so worn the stitching had given out at the knuckles. She had wrapped a length of rawhide around the right one to hold it together. She had not yet bought new gloves. There had not seemed to be a point. She was here for a cow, a Hereford specifically sturdy, broad-backed, a good maternal animal that could throw strong calves and hold her weight through a Wyoming winter on hay alone, if it came to that. She had done the arithmetic on the ride in the kind of quiet, grim calculation that had become the primary occupation of her mind over the past 2 years. The price of the cow against the price of feed. The feed against what the ranch could produce. What the ranch could produce against what it needed to survive. The numbers always came out thin, but they came out. That was what mattered. Coming out on the other side. Redemption on an auction day was as close to a crowd as this corner of Wyoming ever got. Ranchers in their heavy coats stood in loose clusters, stamping their boots against the cold, their breath rising in pale clouds. A few prospectors lingered at the edges, men with the particular hollow look of those who had been promised something by this land and had not yet received it. A handful of townspeople watched from the boardwalk, wrapped in blankets drawn by the spectacle of commerce, in a place where spectacle was rare. Nora stood at the back of the gathering, as she always did. A tall woman leaned through the shoulders with dark hair gone gray at the temples, and a face that had been carved by weather and grief into something angular and composed. She was 38 years old, and she looked it, and she did not think about it. Her stillness was not the stillness of peace. It was the stillness of a woman who had learned to keep everything inside where it could not be seen, because once you let it out, you could not always get it back in. She had not lingered in Redemption for more than the time it took to conduct necessary business in 2 years. She came in, bought what the ranch needed, exchanged the minimum number of words with the minimum number of people, and left. The town knew this about her and had long since stopped trying to change it. There were enough stories about what had happened to Elias Hargrove and enough respect for the manner in which his wife had continued to function in the aftermath that people left Nora Hargrove largely alone. It was a kindness in its way, the only kind she would have accepted. The auctioneer was a man named Pruitt, red-faced and relentless, who had been selling off livestock and salvaged equipment since before the war. His voice was a practiced drone that rose and fell with the rhythm of commerce, attaching numbers to animals and tools and the accumulated belongings of men who had not survived their first winter on the plains. Nora listened with half her attention, tracking the prices, waiting for the Hereford cow that was listed third in the morning's offering. She was counting feed costs in her head when the tone of the crowd shifted. It was subtle at first, a murmur, a repositioning of bodies, the particular kind of attention that moves through a group of people when something unexpected enters the frame. Nora looked up. A different man had taken the platform beside Pruitt. He was perhaps 50 years old, dressed in a coat that was notably cleaner than anything else in Redemption that morning, with the careful grooming of a man who considered his appearance to be a professional tool. His name was Harlan Cole, and Nora had seen him twice before at the edges of things at a land dispute hearing the previous spring, at a supply auction the summer before that. Each time Cole had been present in the way that certain men are present at the misfortunes of others, attentive, composed, and faintly satisfied. Cole was not selling livestock. He was selling a person. She came up onto the platform with her chin level and her eyes fixed on a point somewhere above the heads of the assembled crowd, as though she were looking at something none of them could see. She was small, barely a woman, 18 years old at most, with hair the color of autumn wheat, pulled back from a face smudged with the particular grime of long travel and hard circumstances. Her dress was the color of a prairie after drought-thin cotton that offered nothing against the cold, and her feet were bare on the frozen planks of the auction platform. The skin of her feet had gone a deep, angry blue. She did not shiver. That was the first thing Nora noticed. The girl was cold enough that her lips had taken on a faint purple cast. Cold enough that any reasonable person would have been shaking, and she was not shaking. She had made a decision somewhere before this moment about what she would and would not allow herself to show. Cole spoke in the smooth paternal cadence of a man who had made this particular speech before. An indentured worker, he explained, working off a debt of passage and provisions. Willing, capable, experienced in domestic labor. He started the bidding low, the way you start bidding low on something you know will not go high. The crowd murmured. Nora watched them the way she watched everything quietly from behind the wall of her own composure. She saw the coarse interest in some faces and the discomfort in others, the men who looked away and the men who didn't. She saw the town preacher at the edge of the crowd look down at his boots and find something important to study there. No one bid. The girl on the platform continued to look at her fixed point above the crowd. Her jaw was set. Her hands at her sides were very still. She was performing a kind of dignity that cost her something visible, and she was performing it without a single crack in the surface. Cole lowered the opening number. Still nothing. Nora was looking at the Hereford cow tied to the post at the side of the platform. She was thinking about feed costs. She was thinking about the long ride home and the gray sky that promised more snow before nightfall. She was thinking about Stellan, who was 7 years old, and who had been left in the care of old Mabel Greer from the neighboring claim for the morning, and who would want to know whether his mother had remembered to check if there were any new stones worth collecting near the river bend on the way into town. She was not thinking about the girl on the platform, and then the girl looked at her. She did not know why those eyes stopped on her specifically. Perhaps it was her stillness in the midst of all that shifting and murmuring. Perhaps it was the fact that she was standing slightly apart from the group, or that she was the only woman in the crowd who had not allowed her gaze to slide away in discomfort or pity. Whatever the reason, the girl's eyes found hers and held them, and something in the careful composition of that young face cracked open just slightly, like a fault line appearing in stone. She took half a step forward on those bare blue feet. "Don't buy the cow." Her voice was thin but clear, cutting through the cold air with a precision that silenced the murmuring around them. An Irish accent, faint, but there the particular music of the western counties worn smooth by time and circumstances but not yet gone. "Buy me." She did not look away. There was nothing in her expression that could be called pleading. What was there instead was harder and stranger and more difficult to dismiss the look of a person making a calculated offer from a position of absolute destitution. The look of someone who has assessed the available options and arrived at a conclusion through logic rather than desperation, even if the logic was born of desperation. It was the look of a person who had decided in this moment that survival required honesty. "I'll earn every cent," she said, "and I'll never leave unless you send me away." The crowd was silent in the way that crowds go silent when something real happens in the middle of something theatrical. Nora looked at her for a long moment. She looked at those bare feet on the frozen wood. She looked at the thinness of the dress and the set of that jaw and the steadiness of those eyes. She did the arithmetic, the price of the cow, the price of this girl, what a ranch needed to function, what a house needed to function, what it had been missing in its hollow, dust-collecting silence for the past 2 years. She raised a single gloved finger. Cole's face shifted through something complicated, surprise, calculation, satisfaction, before settling back into its professional smoothness. Prewitt's gavel came down like a gunshot. Nora Hargrove had come to redemption for a cow. She left without one. The wagon road back to the ranch was 12 miles of frozen ruts and gray sky, and they covered it in almost complete silence. The girl sat on the wagon seat beside her, wrapped in the coarse wool blanket Nora had pulled from the gear in the back without comment, offering it over with the same wordless efficiency with which she did most things. The girl had taken it without thanks and without embarrassment, which Nora noted and respected in equal measure. Her name was Bridget. Bridget Callahan. She offered this information in the flat, uninflected tone of someone stating a fact rather than introducing herself about a mile outside of Redemption, as though she had been considering whether to offer it and had decided it cost her nothing to do so. Nora told her name in return, said it was her ranch they were heading to, said she would have her own room, said she expected the work to begin the next morning. She had not planned any of those sentences in advance. They came out in the order that seemed logical, the way that necessary information presents itself when you strip away everything else. Bridget nodded once her back straight, her hands folded in her lap over the edge of the blanket. She looked at the landscape rolling past the gray-white of the frozen grassland, the dark line of pine trees on the ridge, the sky that pressed down low and heavy with the promise of more snow. And her expression was unreadable in the way of someone who has practiced being unreadable until it has become their natural state. Nora kept her eyes on the trail and her thoughts to herself. She had a son to consider. She had a ranch that ran on routine and necessity in the careful management of grief. She had organized her life over the past 2 years into something that worked the way a mechanism works, not because it was alive, but because each part performed its function and the whole thing kept moving. Introducing an unknown element into that mechanism was not something she had planned. It was not something she would have chosen if choice had presented itself in the clean and uncomplicated way that choices rarely do. But the arithmetic had been clear standing there in the cold outside Redemption. And something else had been clear too. Something she did not examine too closely on the long drive home. Something that lived in the memory of those bare blue feet on frozen wood, and the voice that had not pleaded, and the eyes that had not looked away. The ranch came into view around a long bend in the trail as the afternoon light began its early winter retreat. It was a working property, not prosperous, but solid. The main house was built of hewn logs, banked with earth against the cold, with a roof that had been recently patched and a chimney from which smoke rose in a thin, steady line. Behind it, the barn stood dark and substantial. The corrals were empty of cattle for the winter. The animals moved to the lower pasture where the windbreak kept the worst of the weather off them. From the outside, it looked like what it was, a ranch that was being maintained. The necessary work was being done. The snow was cleared from the paths. The wood was split and stacked in orderly rows. Everything that needed to function was functioning. From the outside, you could not see what was missing. Mabel Greer was waiting on the porch when they pulled up a small, round-faced woman in her 60s with the particular expression of someone who has been keeping a careful eye on something and is about to be relieved of the responsibility. She was not a woman given to long speeches, which was one of the reasons Nora found her tolerable. She looked at Bridget on the wagon seat, looked at Nora, and looked back at Bridget with an assessment that was thorough and concluded in about 3 seconds. "Stellan's inside," she said. "He found a new stone. You'll hear about it." She pulled her coat tighter and walked to her own horse without further comment. That was Mabel Greer's particular talent, knowing when more words would only complicate things. Stellan Hargrove was 7 years old, and he had his father's dark hair and his mother's gray eyes, and he carried both inheritances with a solemnity that was slightly unusual in a child of his age. He was on the floor of the main room when they came in, arranging a collection of small stones in a pattern that had its own internal logic, though what that logic was, Nora had never quite been able to determine. Stellan's relationship with stones was private and purposeful, and he did not explain it to people who had not asked. He looked up when they came through the door. He looked at his mother first with the quick, comprehensive assessment of a child who has learned to read an adult's state from a single glance. Then he looked at the girl standing just inside the doorway with a blanket around her shoulders and her chin level, and her eyes taking in the room with the careful attention of someone cataloging details that might later be important. "This is Bridget," Nora said. Her voice came out rougher than she intended, unused to making introductions. "She'll be staying with us." It was not an introduction so much as a statement of fact. Stellan received it as such. He looked at Bridget for another moment, his expression serious and considering, and then he looked back down at his stones. He moved one of them slightly to the left. Whatever calculation he had been performing, it continued without visible interruption. Nora showed Bridget to the small room at the back of the house. It had been used for storage before Elias got sick, and then for other things during the long months of his decline, and now it was used for storage again. She had cleared it out that morning, had risen before dawn, and moved everything into the barn with the quiet, methodical urgency of a woman who has made a decision and is enacting it before she has time to reconsider. The narrow cot had a mattress that was thin but sound. There was a small stove in the corner unlit. A single candle on the windowsill. "You can sleep here," she said. She left a blanket on the cot and a box of matches beside the candle and pulled the door shut behind her. She stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the silence of the house, which now had a different shape to it, a different weight. There was a person breathing in a room that had been empty, and the house was aware of it in the way that houses are aware of such things. She went to tend the livestock and did not allow herself to think about it further. That first evening, she made supper the way she always made it: smoked bacon, boiled beans, cornbread, baked in the iron skillet. Functional food. Food that existed to provide calories and heat, not pleasure. She set 2 plates on the table for herself and Stellan, and then she stood at the stove and looked at those 2 plates for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. She got out a 3rd plate. Bridget ate last, and only a little standing at the edge of the kitchen rather than at the table, until Nora looked at her and then looked at the empty chair and looked away again, which Bridget apparently understood as the invitation. It was because she sat down. She ate in the careful, economical way of someone who has learned not to assume that there will be more. Stellan ate his beans and observed her with the same quiet attention he gave to stones of potential interest, which was his highest form of regard. After supper, Bridget washed the dishes without being asked. She did it quickly and without waste, and when she was done, she dried her hands and looked at the room in that cataloging way she had, taking inventory of what was there and what wasn't, what needed doing and what could wait. Nora sat by the stove with her coffee and watched from the corner of her eye and said nothing because there was nothing that needed saying yet. The fire in the stove ticked and breathed. Outside, the wind had picked up again, pressing against the walls of the house with a low, persistent sound. Bridget went to bed without ceremony. Nora sat alone by the stove for a long time after, in the silence that was the same silence it had always been, and also somehow different. And she looked at the shape of the room and listened to the new sound that was in it, which was the sound of another person existing in a space that had been given over entirely to absence. Across the room in the corner beside the hearth, the rocking chair sat where it had always sat. Elias had built it himself the second winter. They were on the ranch, had spent 3 months on it in the evening, sanding the wood until it was smooth as riverstone. He had sat in it every evening after supper, doing whatever reading or mending or quiet thinking the day had left unfinished. The wood was smooth from years of use. There was a small worn place on the right armrest where his hand had rested evening after evening, year after year. The chair was coated now in a thin, even layer of dust that Nora had never been able to bring herself to disturb. She looked at it for a while. Then she got up, poured her coffee into the basin, and went to bed. Bridget Callahan did not wait to be told what to do. This was the first thing, and in some ways the most important thing, that Nora came to understand about her in those early days. She moved through the cold morning dark with a purposefulness that owed nothing to instruction or permission. She had assessed the household the way someone assesses a problem, systematically without sentiment, and she had identified what needed doing and begun doing it in the order that made the most sense to her. The mending basket beside the cold hearth was the first thing. It had been accumulating for months: shirts with fraying cuffs, one of Stellan's pairs of trousers with a hole worn through both knees, a work jacket of Nora's with a split seam along the shoulder that had been making the cold worse than it needed to be. Bridget found the needle and thread in a small tin on the kitchen shelf, and she sat in the gray pre-dawn with her knees together and her back straight and her fingers moving in small, precise patterns. The stitches were tiny and even and nearly invisible, the work of hands trained to it long before the circumstances that had brought her here. She made no sound at all. The only evidence of her presence was the whisper of thread through cloth and the faint sound of her breathing, and the occasional creak of the chair she had pulled to the window to catch the earliest light. When Nora came in from the first morning chores, the mending was done and folded in a neat pile beside the hearth. The floor had been swept, the cold stove had been cleared of ash and relaid with kindling and wood, and the fire was already burning with a steady, well-built heat. Nora stood in the doorway and looked at these things. Then she poured her coffee and went back outside. Bridget cooked. She cooked practically without flourish, using what was there and not apologizing for its limitations. The flatbread she made that first morning was nothing more than flour and salt and water cooked on the stovetop, but it was warm and nourishing, and when she set it on the table alongside the bacon and beans Nora had already prepared, it completed the meal in a way that nothing about Nora's cooking had completed anything in a long time. Stellan ate 2 pieces. He was a child who ate what was in front of him without comment, in the manner of children raised in households where food is understood as fuel rather than occasion. But he ate the second piece of bread with something that was almost enthusiasm, which in Stellan's particular emotional register was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Bridget ate last and little as she had the night before. Nora watched this without comment, but she noticed it the way Bridget took the smallest portion without making a performance of it, the way she ate standing at the edge of things until the invitation came, the way her eyes were always moving in the quiet, careful pattern of someone who has learned to track the details of a situation because the details are where the danger lives. She noticed the blue-gray color that persisted in Bridget's feet, despite the wool socks she had found somewhere in the household stores. She noticed the thin fabric of the dress, which had been patched in several places with careful stitching, but which was not and could not be made into adequate insulation against a Wyoming winter. She noticed all of it. And she said nothing because saying anything would have required a kind of directness that was no longer natural to her, and because actions had always been her more fluent language. The first act of that language came 3 mornings after the auction. She had found the boots in the back of the barn storage, a good pair bought the second winter before the last for ranch work, and barely worn before circumstances had changed. The leather was stiff but sound, and she spent an evening working dubbin into it until it softened and darkened to a deep, healthy brown. She packed the toes with folded wool fleece from the barn stores, enough to bring them to something close to the right size for feet considerably smaller than her own. She left them outside Bridget's door before first light. Given that Bridget was awake before dawn, this meant rising in the deep dark of 3 in the morning to do it. Nora did not examine this fact too closely. There was no note. There was nothing written. There were just the boots standing neatly beside the door, and the information they carried was self-evident. She was in the barn when she heard Bridget's door open. She did not go to look, but she stood very still for a moment in the barn smell of hay and horse and cold wood, and listened to the silence, and whatever was in that silence she kept it to herself. The woodpile outside Bridget's room was the next thing. She built it over 2 days, splitting wood in the cold afternoons with the steady, familiar rhythm of axe against block, and she stacked it considerably higher than any reasonable heating need required. It was enough to keep that small room warm through 2 winters, not 1. She understood this while she was doing it. She did not stop. The following week, she came back from a supply run to Redemption with a bolt of dark blue wool flannel. She set it on the kitchen table without comment. It was enough fabric for a proper dress, thick and warm, with enough left over for a shawl besides. That evening, she came through the kitchen and found Bridget at the table with the fabric unfolded before her hands, moving over it in that careful, assessing way, measuring by eye with a precision that required no ruler. She had found the household scissors. Bridget looked up when Nora appeared in the doorway. Nora looked at her. It was a moment that lasted less than 2 seconds and contained more information than either of them had exchanged in words since the auction. Nora saw Bridget register her presence, absorb it, file it away with the same efficient thoroughness with which she absorbed everything. She saw in Bridget's expression not gratitude exactly, and not surprise exactly, but something adjacent to both a quiet revision of whatever she had been calculating about who Nora was and what she was likely to do. Nora turned and walked back out to the porch. The days settled into a pattern. Bridget cooked and cleaned and mended. She swept the floors and banked the fires and checked the water barrels and sorted through the dried goods in the kitchen stores with systematic attention. She moved through the house with a steady, quiet relentlessness that did not announce itself but did not stop. There were things she did not touch. She did not move any of the furniture. She did not rearrange the kitchen shelves or alter the placement of anything that had been placed by someone else. She worked around the existing order of the house as though she understood instinctively that this order was not hers to revise, that it was the sediment of another life that still held meaning even in its neglected state. She never touched the rocking chair. This was a thing Nora noticed with a constancy she could not fully account for. Every person who had come into the house in the 2 years since Elias's death had eventually touched that chair, pushed it aside to sweep under it, or sat in it briefly while waiting for Nora to come in from outside, or run a cloth over it in an effort to be helpful. Every person except Bridget. She moved around it the way you move around something that belongs to someone, not something that has been abandoned. It was a distinction so precise and made so without effort that Nora felt it as something that could not have been performed. It had to be understood. Stellan was the first to move toward her. He was a careful child, not cautious, but methodical. He did not extend himself toward things or people until he had gathered sufficient information, and gathering information required direct observation over time. He watched Bridget for the better part of a week with the focused, unobtrusive attention he usually reserved for stones of unusual composition, noting details and filing them away. He noticed that she saved the driest pieces of kindling for the morning fire. He noticed that she moved around his mother's silences as though they were furniture familiar and fixed, requiring no commentary. He noticed that when she looked at him, her eyes were kind in a way that required nothing from him in return. He noticed that she always took the smallest piece of bread. One afternoon toward the end of that first week, while Bridget was working bread dough on the floured kitchen table, he came and stood beside her. He had been carrying something in his right hand held loosely at his side, where it was not quite visible. And after a moment of standing there while she continued working the dough without looking at him or stopping, he set it down on the table beside her left hand. It was a stone, white smooth, rounded by water into a shape that sat perfectly in the palm, with a faint translucence at its center when held to the light. Nora had seen Stellan carrying it for months. It was as far as she could tell his most prized possession. Bridget stopped kneading. She looked at the stone. Then she looked at the boy who stood with his hands at his sides and his expression serious, waiting. She picked the stone up, turned it once in her flour-dusted fingers, and held it briefly toward the window light. Then she set it carefully back on the table between them, not returned to him, left there as shared territory, and gave him a single slow nod. She put the stone in her apron pocket when she went back to the dough. Stellan watched her do it. Then he climbed up onto the stool at the end of the table and sat there while she worked, and neither of them said anything. And somehow the silence between them was a different kind of silence than the other silences in that house. It had something warm in it. Nora saw it from the hallway. She had come in from the barn without making much noise, and she stood in the hallway and looked through the kitchen doorway at her son on the stool and the girl working the dough and the pale winter light coming through the window and doing something soft to all of it. She stood there longer than was strictly necessary. Then she went back outside. A few days later, Stellan spoke to Bridget directly for the first time. It was on the porch on a morning when the cold had briefly relented, and Bridget was sweeping the boards with methodical strokes, her breath clouding in the cold air. Stellan came through the door in his coat and stopped and looked at her. "What is your name?" he asked. Bridget stopped sweeping. "Bridget," she said. It was the first time she had said her own name aloud in this house. Nora, who was inside near the window and could hear through the glass, went still. Stellan repeated it once quietly, the way he repeated things he was committing to a serious category. Then he went down the porch steps to look at something in the snow, apparently satisfied. After that, he followed her. Not constantly, not in the way of a child who needs reassurance, but in the way of someone who has found a person worth observing. He helped scatter the chicken feed and handed her things when she was working, and sat near the hearth when she sewed, occasionally narrating his observations about the weather, or the cattle, or the hawk that had been circling the valley for the past several days. She listened with her eyes on her work and her attention fully present, asking small, quiet questions that showed she had been tracking everything he said. The house, which had been so profoundly silent for so long, began to have sound in it again. Nora heard it, heard her son's voice in the kitchen, and the sound of Bridget's responses, and the ordinary sounds of two people occupying a space together. She sat in the evenings with her coffee and heard these things and kept her expression still, but something in her chest, in the exact place where the cold had been living for 2 years, did something that was not quite a movement, but was perhaps the precursor to one. She watched her son take Bridget's hand one afternoon as they walked back from the barn, the small fingers slipping into hers, without preamble or negotiation, the way children reach for what they need before they've learned to question whether reaching is permitted. She watched Stellan show Bridget a drawing he'd made in the dirt beside the water trough, crouching down to point out the details with the focused pride of a small person who has made something worth seeing. She watched all of it and said nothing, and allowed nothing of what she felt to show on her face, because she had become very good over the past 2 years at not showing what she felt. But the arithmetic was always running. It was always running, and lately the numbers were pointing somewhere she had not looked in a long time. It was on a cold afternoon, perhaps 10 days after the auction, that Harlan Cole appeared. Nora heard the horse before she saw the rider, the deliberate, unhurried pace, the quality of confidence it expressed, and something in that sound made her set down her work and straighten before the rider came around the bend in the access road. She was standing at the fence when Cole came into view, watching him ride toward the house with the attention she gave to things that needed to be understood before they arrived. Cole dismounted with the ease of a man accustomed to good horses and stable ground. He stamped the snow from his boots on the porch steps in a gesture that was almost proprietary, as though arriving somewhere where his comfort was expected to be accommodated. "Mrs. Hargrove," his voice had the particular smoothness of someone who has spent a long time practicing pleasantness. "I was passing nearby, thought I'd stop in to check on the girl, make sure she's settling in comfortably." Nora stood in the yard and did not invite him inside. "She's fine," she said. Cole's smile did not change. It was a very stable smile. "Glad to hear it. You'll find her worth her cost." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small ledger bound in dark leather with a brass clasp. "Which does put me in mind of a matter I should have explained more thoroughly at the time of sale. The purchase price covers the base debt. The full indenture, however, runs somewhat longer. There are accumulated costs, her passage, her provisions over several months. It's all documented here." He held the ledger out as though Nora should come and look at it. Nora did not move. In the kitchen, through the closed window, Bridget was washing the noon dishes. She heard Cole's voice before she heard his words, heard the quality of it. The oiled smoothness and the sound traveled through her, the way cold travels through thin cloth, immediate and total. Her hands went still in the basin. She turned very slightly toward the window. The angle was bad. She could not see much. But Cole had moved to show Nora the ledger, and he had angled it toward the light in a way that brought it briefly into her line of sight through the gap in the curtain. She saw the page. She saw the entry at the bottom, the neat column of figures totaling a sum that made the Hereford cow seem like a modest morning's work. And she saw with the clarity of someone who had spent months watching a man write false numbers into ledger pages that the ink on that final entry was darker than the ink on everything above it. Fresher. Written after a different pen had touched the page. She looked at that ink for as long as she could see it. Then she turned back to the basin and continued washing the dish in her hands. Cole's visit lasted 12 more minutes. He left the way he had come, smoothly, pleasantly, with a smile that gave nothing away. He mounted his horse and rode back down the access road at the same unhurried pace, as though he had simply been making a neighborly call. Nora stood at the fence until horse and rider disappeared around the bend. Then she went inside. Bridget was at the stove, no longer washing dishes. She had moved to the pot already on for supper and was stirring it with that same steady, economical motion. But her back was very straight, and her shoulders were set in a line that was different from their usual line. Nora stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her back. She did not say anything about Cole's visit or the ledger or what it meant. She did not know yet what she was going to do about any of it, and she had learned a long time ago that speaking before knowing what to say was less useful than keeping quiet and letting the problem take its proper shape. She went to pour her coffee and stopped. The cups were on the shelf to the right of the stove where they had always been, where Elias had put them the first week they were in this house, and where they had stayed through everything that came after. Nora reached up and took one down. Then she stood with it in her hand for a moment, looking at the shelf. She reached up and took down a second cup. She set both cups on the table. She poured coffee into both of them. She put the pot back on the stove and pulled out her chair and sat down. Bridget had heard the sounds of this without turning around. She heard the two cups, not one. The slight hesitation between the first pour and the second. She stood at the stove with her back to Nora and her hand on the wooden spoon and did not move for a breath and then two. Then she turned around and came to the table. She sat down at the other cup. She wrapped both hands around the warmth of it, and outside the wind pressed against the walls of the house with its cold, persistent voice, and inside the fire in the stove burned with its steady heat. Nobody said anything. Stellan came in from the back room with a stone in his hand and climbed into his chair and began to study it with intense professional focus, in the sound of the three of them existing in that kitchen. The woman at her coffee, the girl at hers. The boy in his stone was not a large sound. It was barely a sound at all, but the house received it the way a person who has been holding their breath for a long time receives air, with something that was not quite gratitude and not quite relief, but lived in the neighborhood of both. That night after Stellan was in bed and Bridget had gone to her room, Nora sat for a long time alone by the stove. She looked at the rocking chair across the room, the worn smooth of the wood, the small depression in the right armrest, the dust that she had not disturbed in 2 years and that had become in its way a kind of memorial, the last record of someone's daily presence. She thought about the ledger and its fresh ink. She thought about Cole's smile and what lived behind it. She thought about a girl with bare blue feet on a frozen platform making a calculated offer from a position of absolute destitution, who had not pleaded and had not looked away. She thought about her son's hand slipping into that girl's hand on the walk from the barn, about what it meant that he had reached when he had reached for nothing in 2 years. She thought about 2 cups of coffee on the table set down without thinking, the body moving ahead of the mind. She sat with all of it for a long time. Outside the stars that showed between the clouds were the hard, bright stars of deep winter, the kind that look close enough to touch and are further away than anything you can imagine. Inside, in the back of the house, a person was breathing in a room that had been empty. Nora Hargrove, who had come to Redemption for a cow, sat by her stove and looked at the rocking chair and did the arithmetic of a problem entirely different from the one she was accustomed to. One where the numbers for the first time in 2 years seemed to be pointing somewhere other than mere survival. She stayed there until the fire burned low. Then she got up and added wood to it enough to last through the night and stepped back and looked at the room and let the decision she had been making without quite knowing she was making it settle into something she could carry. The blizzard arrived without warning, which was the only way blizzards arrived in Wyoming. 1 hour the sky was the usual flat gray of a winter afternoon, pressing down on the world with its customary indifference. The next hour it was white, so total and so sudden that Nora, who had been in the lower pasture checking on the cattle, could not see the barn from 30 feet away. She moved through it by memory and by the rope she had strung between the barn and the house in October for exactly this reason, hand over hand through the howling white, the wind hitting her with a force that was almost personal. She got the animals secured. She got the barn doors battened. She followed the rope back to the house and came through the door into the warmth of the kitchen with ice in her eyebrows and snow packed into every gap in her clothing. And she stood in the entry, pulling off her frozen outer layers, while the wind outside took the door and tried to have it back. Bridget was at the stove. She had, without being told, moved the water barrels in from the porch before they could freeze solid, restock the wood boxes in both rooms, and put a pot of something on that smelled of sage and salt and the deep, comforting warmth of things that have been cooking slowly. She looked at Nora when she came in, assessed her condition quickly and thoroughly, and said nothing because nothing needed saying. She went back to the pot. Stellan was at the table with his stones and a piece of paper on which he was making careful marks that may or may not have been a map of something. He looked up at his mother with his usual comprehensive assessment, decided she was satisfactory, and went back to his paper. The storm built through the afternoon and into the evening, finding its full voice sometime around dark, filling the world outside with a roar that was almost oceanic. Nora sat by the stove with her coffee and listened to the house creak and hold and creak again. Running the calculations, she always ran the cattle in the lower pasture, the roof on the smaller outbuilding, the dozen other things that could go wrong in weather like this. She was a woman who managed difficulty by cataloging it, and cataloging it kept her steady. Bridget moved through the evening in her usual pattern, washing up after supper, checking the fires in both rooms, banking them for the night, with the practiced hand of someone who understands that a fire is not just comfort, but survival. She passed through the main room and did not look at the rocking chair, and went to her room, and the house settled into its nighttime silence, with the storm providing a constant, furious counterpoint to the quiet within its walls. The second day of this blizzard was the same as the first, only more so. The wind found new registers, new ways of pressing against the wood and the glass. The snow built up against the north side of the house until the lower portion of the window in the main room was blocked, giving the light a strange, muffled quality. Nora tunneled out to the barn in the morning to water and feed the horses, came back plastered in white, did it again in the afternoon. Between these expeditions, she sat at the table doing the kind of account work that always accumulated at the edges of more pressing business numbers and ledger columns. Figures that told the story of a ranch operating at the margin of what was possible. Bridget made meals and kept the fires and moved through the house with a steady, unhurried competence, present and purposeful. Stellan talked to her about the hawk. He had a theory that it was the same hawk every year returning to the same valley because he had found the thermal patterns there to be particularly reliable. He explained this theory in careful detail while Bridget stitched a tear in one of Nora's work shirts, and she asked questions that showed she had followed every word of it, and Nora listened from behind her ledger and noted that her son had just used more consecutive sentences than she had heard from him in several months. It was on the second night, deep in it, maybe 3 hours past midnight, that Stellan cried out. Not a nightmare sound. Something worse, a thin, wordless cry that cut through the walls of sleep with the particular quality of a child in physical distress. Nora was out of her bed and across the hall before she was fully awake, moving on the instinct that had been running quietly underneath everything since the day Elias died. The constant low-frequency alertness of a parent who is the only protection between a child and whatever comes. She put her hand on Stellan's forehead and her stomach dropped. The heat was immediate and alarming, the kind of fever that announces itself before you've fully registered what you're touching. The boy was half awake, his eyes opening and closing without focus, his lips moving around words that had lost their shapes. His skin was dry and burning, and the color that skin goes when a fever has been building for hours and has not yet decided where it will stop. Nora stood at the side of the bed with her hand on her son's forehead and felt the thing she had most feared feeling in her life, a helplessness so profound it had physical properties, a weight in the chest and a hollowness in the hands. She was a woman who met every problem with action, with the practical application of available resources toward the resolution of a defined difficulty. She had buried her husband and kept her son alive, and kept the land running, and kept herself functional through a grief that could have taken her apart if she had allowed it any purchase. She could not do anything about this. The doctor was in redemption, 12 miles of blizzard. Impossible. She stood at the side of the bed with her useless hands and her burning child, and felt the walls of her competence end at exactly the point where they were most needed, and the space beyond those walls was very large and very dark. She did not hear Bridget until she was already at the other side of the bed. She had come without being called, had heard the cry the same way Nora had heard it through walls, and sleep with the instant alertness of someone whose vigilance never fully rests. She was in her night clothes with a shawl over her shoulders and her feet in the wool-stuffed boots, and she had something in her hands, a cloth bag, small and dark, that she had apparently retrieved from her room on the way. She put her hand on Stellan's forehead, then his cheek, then the back of his neck, her fingers moving in a quick practice assessment, not the random touching of anxiety, but the systematic examination of someone who has done this before and knows what she is looking for. She looked up at Nora across the bed. "How long?" she asked. "I don't know. He was fine at supper." She nodded once, taking this in. She opened the cloth bag on the edge of the bed, and Nora saw what was in it. Small bundles of dried plant material carefully tied with thread, 3 or 4 different kinds. Things that had the particular gray-green color of plants gathered in the wild and dried with care. There was a small tin as well, sealed with a cork. "My father was a healer," Bridget said, not explaining, just offering the fact that made the next part make sense. "Let me work." She did not ask for permission exactly. She stated what she needed and waited for Nora to either stand aside or not. And Nora stood aside because the alternative was doing nothing with better posture. She worked at the stove, moving the cloth bags into hot water in the small pot, adding things from the tin in amounts she measured by eye, with a confidence born of knowledge, not guesswork. Her hands did not shake. Her movements did not hesitate. She murmured to herself as she worked under her breath, some kind of internal accounting of what she was doing and why. The tisane she made was dark and fragrant, with something that smelled like the mountain meadows in August. A smell so incongruous in the middle of a February blizzard that it had an almost physical shock to it. She brought it to the bedside in a cup and sat on the edge of the bed and coaxed it into Stellan a spoonful at a time, patient and steady, waiting for each small amount to be swallowed before offering the next. Stellan muttered and turned his head, and she turned it back with a hand on his cheek. Not roughly, not with any force at all, just with the quiet insistence of someone who was going to see this through. Nora sat in the chair in the corner of the room. She had pulled it there without thinking about it, needing to be in the room, but understanding that she was not the useful person in it right now. The useful person was small and Irish and working by the light of a single lamp, with the focused attention of someone who has narrowed the entire world down to one sick child and what that child needs next. She watched Bridget work. She had known people who were good at things. She had rarely known someone whose capability was so thoroughly integrated into the way they moved through the world that it did not occur to them to announce it or perform it. Bridget simply did what needed doing in the order it needed doing, and the doing was very good. Nora sat in her corner and felt something shift in the understanding she had been building of the situation since the auction. She had bought Bridget for a price. She had been thinking in the weeks since about what that price did and did not include about the careful accumulation of small kindnesses she had been offering in the language of objects, rather than words about the way the house had changed shape around Bridget's presence. She had not until this moment fully reckoned with what Bridget was doing for her. Not what she was producing, what she was doing for her. The specific targeted generosity of a person who owed her nothing beyond what a contract specified, applying everything she had, the knowledge her father had given her, the watchfulness her circumstances had developed, the endurance that was simply her own, to the preservation of the one thing in Nora's life that she could not survive losing. Bridget changed the cloth on Stellan's forehead every 20 minutes. She kept the cup of tisane warm and continued to coax it into him through the long hours of the night. She talked to the boy quietly in a voice too low for Nora to make out the words, a murmur that had the rhythm of a story or a prayer or something in between. Somewhere in the black hours when the storm had settled into a kind of grim permanence and the lamp was burning low and Nora had gotten up twice to feed the fire and returned both times to her corner chair, Stellan's eyes opened with a focus they hadn't had before. He looked at Bridget, who was sitting beside him with her hand on the back of his, the cloth ready for the next change. "Are you my mama?" he asked. His voice was thin and rough with the fever, but the words were clear. Bridget went very still. Nora in her corner stopped breathing. She did not answer. She did not say yes, and she did not say no, and she did not flinch away from the question or make the small sounds of adult discomfort that adults make when children ask things that land too close to something true. She simply sat with the question, let it be what it was, and then she took the cloth from his forehead and dipped it in the cool water and wrung it and placed it back, and she said very quietly something in Irish that Nora did not understand, and that somehow, for that reason, did not require her to. Stellan's eyes closed again. Nora got up quietly and went out into the hallway and stood there in the dark for a moment with her back against the wall. The storm pressed against the house. She could feel it through the wood, the constant, indifferent pressure of a force that didn't know or care what was happening inside these walls. The lamp in the room behind her cast a thin line of light under the door. She stood in the dark hallway and thought about Elias, who had held that boy when he was barely 3 days old and had not lived to see his 4th birthday. She thought about the gray eyes that were hers that Stellan carried in his face every day, like a message from a person who was no longer here to receive replies. She thought about what it meant that a child who had not spoken of needing a mother in 2 years had asked in his fever if the girl at his bedside was her. She stood in the dark hallway for a long time. Then she went back to her corner chair and she sat there through the rest of the night, and she did not sleep. The storm broke on the morning of the 3rd day. It simply stopped the way Wyoming weather stops abruptly without transition, as though a decision had been made somewhere above the clouds and enacted immediately. Between 1 hour and the next, the roaring white was replaced by a silence so complete it had an almost physical weight of its own. The sky that appeared above the drifts was the pale washed blue of a world that has been scoured clean. Stellan's fever broke with it. It went the way fevers go when they go well, not all at once, but in a gradual easing, a slow release of heat, until Nora put her hand on her son's forehead in the gray dawn light and felt something close to normal temperature, and had to stand there for a moment with her eyes shut, breathing through the specific relief that only comes after the specific fear that preceded it. Bridget was asleep in the chair. She had not left the room. Through the last hours of the night and the slow arrival of morning, she had stayed at her post. And somewhere in those final hours, exhaustion had pulled her down into sleep, folding her into the chair with her knees drawn up and her shawl pulled around her. She looked younger in sleep. She looked like the 18 years she actually was, which was a thing she did not often look like. Nora stood at the side of the bed and looked at her sleeping son, and then at the sleeping girl, and she took the extra blanket from the foot of Stellan's bed and put it over Bridget carefully, not wanting to wake her. Bridget did not wake. She made a small sound and settled deeper into the chair and was quiet. Nora went out to the barn to dig out and tend the horses, and she worked in the brilliant, blinding white of the aftermath for a long time. And when she came back inside, Bridget was awake and the fire was rebuilt, and there was porridge on the stove, and Stellan was sitting up in bed with his color back and a stone in his hand, examining it with the meditative focus of a child returned to himself. Nora stood in the doorway of her son's room and looked at these things. She looked at Bridget, who was at the small table in the corner tidying her cloth bags with the same systematic care she brought to everything, rebundling the dried materials, recorking the tin, cataloging what had been used and what remained. "Bridget," Nora said. She looked up. "Thank you," Nora said. It was the first time she had said it. 2 words entirely inadequate, and she knew they were inadequate, and she said them anyway because they were what she had. Bridget received them with a small nod, absorbing the information without making a performance of the receiving. She did not say it was nothing. She did not deflect or diminish. She simply acknowledged that the words had been said and went back to tying the bundle of dried sage with her piece of thread. That evening, as Stellan slept soundly and the house settled into the quiet of its recovery, Nora made supper and Bridget set the table, and the ordinary sounds of the two of them moving through an ordinary evening were both exactly what they had always been and entirely different. After Stellan was asleep and the dishes were done, Nora sat at the table with her coffee. "How did you know what to do?" she asked. Bridget was quiet for a moment, her hands wrapped around her own cup. When she spoke, it was carefully offering information the way you offer something valuable in the appropriate amount without waste. She told Nora about her father, Patrick Callahan of County Clare, a man who had accumulated knowledge of plants and their properties from sources both traditional and printed, who had been the nearest thing to a doctor that several surrounding townlands had ever had, who had taught his daughter the names of plants and the uses of them, not because he was training her, but because she was curious, and he was a man who responded to curiosity as a form of invitation. She told her about the famine not in detail, but in the bare, clear lines of what had happened, the years of it. Her father had lasted longer than many because he knew what could be eaten and what could not, and shared this knowledge freely, but knowledge of which grass is edible is not ultimately sufficient against a famine of sufficient magnitude. She told her about this ship, about her mother, Maura Callahan, who had been a strong woman in Ireland and who had been taken by the fever that moved through the lower decks in the third week of the crossing, in the particular efficient way that fever moves through people who are already depleted. She told it without sentiment because sentiment was a luxury, and she had been living without luxuries for long enough that she no longer felt their absence in the usual way. She told her about Nevada, about her brother Cormac, 2 years older, who had found work on the railroad and who had been good at it and who had been dead at the bottom of a grading cut before the end of his second month when a charge went off too early. That was how she had come to Harlan Cole. She said his name flatly without inflection. Cole had been in the vicinity of the camp when the accident happened, as he always seemed to be in the vicinity of disasters that left people without resources. He had offered her food shelter passage north and east. He had presented himself as a man simply willing to extend credit to those in need. She understood the terms clearly enough within the first week. "My father taught me arithmetic," she said. "I see the shapes that numbers make when they are being used honestly and the different shape they make when they are not." She paused. "His ledger never balanced. Every time I paid something down, something new appeared. Passage costs, room costs, things that had not been discussed and could not be verified. And the final entry that he showed you." She stopped. "The ink," Nora said. She met Nora's eyes. "Written after the sale. I could see it from the kitchen window, only barely but enough. The rest of the entries were months old. That one was days." The fire in the stove ticked. Outside, the night was the profound quiet of a world under new snow. Nora sat with this for a moment. Then she said Elias. It was the first time she had said her husband's name at a table with another person present in 2 years. It sat in the air between them with more weight than 4 letters should be able to carry. She told Bridget about Elias Hargrove of Laramie, Wyoming, who had come to this land with a particular kind of stubbornness that was indistinguishable from optimism, and who had built this house with his own hands over 2 summers, and who had filled it with the particular quality of presence that some people have, the kind that makes a space feel inhabited rather than merely occupied. Who had built the rocking chair himself and sat in it every evening and had not seen his son turn 5. She told her about the mine accident, about the morning she had gone into Redemption for supplies in October of 1885 and had come home to find old Mabel Greer on the porch with Stellan on her hip and a man from the mine office standing beside her with his hat in his hands. She told her about the 2 years since. Not the grief of it, she did not have words for the grief, but the shape of it. What it looked like from the outside, which was a woman running a ranch and raising a boy and conducting the daily business of survival with perfect functional adequacy. What it felt like from the inside was a question she set aside before she finished forming it. Bridget listened. She listened the way she did everything with her full attention without performing the listening. She did not make sounds of sympathy. She did not offer the assurances and the time heals and the you must feels, all the verbal furniture that people arrange around grief to make themselves more comfortable in its presence. She simply received what Nora said and held it, and that was worth more than the other things would have been. When Nora stopped talking, the fire was lower and the coffee was cold, and it was later than either of them had probably intended. She got up and put wood on the fire. She did not look at the rocking chair, which she was aware of in the way she was always aware of it, the constant peripheral presence of a specific absence. "I'll go check the livestock," she said, which was not entirely necessary at this hour, but was what she said when she needed to be outside and alone for a while. Bridget nodded and began gathering the cups from the table, and by the time Nora had her coat and hat, Bridget was at the basin, and the small, ordinary sound of water and crockery in the nighttime kitchen followed Nora to the door in a way she could not quite name. She was in the barns for half an hour. She stood with her hand on the neck of the older horse, a gray gelding that Stellan had named Rock with his customary practicality, and she looked at the barn wall and thought about a man from Laramie who had built a rocking chair by hand and sat in it every evening, and about a girl from County Clare who knew what plants to gather before a storm and could read the age of ink by its color. Then she went back inside. 3 days later, Nora rode to Redemption for supplies. She kept the visit short the way she always did, the general store, the feed merchant in and out with what was needed. She was loading the wagon outside the feed merchant when Clara Walsh appeared at her elbow. Clara Walsh was a woman in her late 40s, a rancher's widow who had the particular face of someone who has been through something that rearranged her understanding of how the world works and has not yet fully made peace with the new arrangement. She had run the Walsh spread alone for 2 years, and she ran it adequately, but there was something behind her eyes that was not adequacy. "Hargrove," she said, keeping her voice low. She glanced toward the street the way people glance when they do not want to be seen talking to someone. "I heard you bought the Callahan girl at auction." Nora looked at her steadily. "That's right. Cole came to see you." It was not a question. Nora nodded. Clara pulled her coat tighter and then said the things she had come to say in a rapid, quiet sequence, as though she had been rehearsing them and wanted to get through them before something stopped her. Cole had done to the Walsh Ranch exactly what he was beginning to do to Nora's the ledger. The accumulated debt, the legal documents with the official seal that were either forged or obtained from officials in Cole's pocket, of which there were at least 2 in this county. He had taken their best breeding stock as payment toward a debt that had never been correctly calculated and could not be correctly calculated because the calculation was being done by Cole. He had taken 6 months of their operation before Clara had found a lawyer in Cheyenne who eventually made the thing stop, and by then the ranch had been reduced to something that functioned but would never again be what it had been. "He doesn't come to collect debts," she said. "He comes to take things. The debt is just the mechanism." She looked at Nora with the eyes of someone who has bought their education in a market with very high prices. "Whatever that girl has that he wants back, it's not the money. He made an example of us when we resisted," she said. "He'll want to make one of you too." She paused. "He has Deputy Doyle, and there are others. Be careful what you say in front of anyone in this town." Then she walked away in the direction of the dry goods store, not looking back, a woman who had done what she came to do and was now going to do the next thing, which was her way of continuing to exist. Nora finished loading the wagon. She drove home in the cold afternoon light with the information settling into her, the way cold settles into a person who has been outside too long, gradually, comprehensively finding its way into every part of the system. She thought about Doyle, who she had seen twice in the past 2 months, and who had the particular manner of a man wearing an authority that did not originate with him. She thought about the judge in Grayson County, whose decisions she had observed over time and had not admired. She thought about the ledger with its fresh ink and what it represented, not a debt, but a claim, a means of reaching into her house and taking something that was inside it. She thought about what she was willing to do about that, and the arithmetic of that problem was different from any arithmetic she had done before, because this time the numbers were not about survival. They were about something that lived on the other side of survival in a territory she had not visited in 2 years and had begun to suspect she might visit again. Bridget was in the kitchen when Nora came in. She heard the boots on the porch and appeared in the kitchen doorway, and something in Nora's face, whatever she was not keeping as carefully contained as usual, made her go still. Nora sat down at the table. She told Bridget what Clara Walsh had said. Bridget sat across from her and listened with her hands flat on the table and her face very composed. She had gone in the course of the telling into that particular quality of stillness Nora recognized as her most serious thinking. Not emptiness, but its opposite, a gathering of everything inward where it could be applied with maximum efficiency. When Nora finished, Bridget was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "There is something I haven't told you." She got up and went to her room. She came back with a small notebook thin with a cover of dark cloth. She set it on the table between them and looked at it for a moment before she looked at Nora. "From the first week I was with Cole," she said, "I kept records." She had watched him make his entries in the ledger. She had seen the way numbers changed between one viewing and the next, the way dates were occasionally impossible in their sequencing. And she had done what her father had taught her to do with things that were important and fragile and in danger of being altered. She had copied them. Every transaction she had witnessed or could reconstruct. Every debt listed against her and the original figures before they were revised. Every name she had heard mentioned in connection with his business, every amount, every date. "I see the shape of it," she said, "what he does and how he does it, and to how many people." She touched the cover of the notebook without opening it. "This isn't just enough to answer the claim he's making against me. It's enough to answer every claim he's ever made." Nora looked at the notebook and then at Bridget. She was 18 years old, and she had spent the months of her captivity in a state of such alert, systematic attention that she had built in this small cloth-covered book the complete architecture of a man's criminal enterprise. She had done it without knowing whether it would ever be of use. She had done it because her father had taught her that knowledge is the one thing that cannot be taken from you. "Cole is coming back," Bridget said. "He'll bring Doyle. He'll have a paper with a seal on it." She was not speaking with fear. She was speaking with the precision of someone who has mapped the terrain and is describing it accurately. "He'll give you a number that's more than the ranch is worth, and he'll expect you to either pay it or hand me over because those are the choices he'll believe you have." Nora's hand rested on the table very still. "Those aren't the only choices," Bridget said. Nora looked at her. She looked at the notebook. Outside, the late afternoon sky was beginning to close in again, the particular purple-gray of approaching weather, and the wind that had been quiet since the blizzard broke was finding its voice once more in the pines along the ridge. "No," Nora said. "They're not." She reached across the table and put the notebook in the inside pocket of her coat, and the decision that this gesture represented was not something she announced or explained. It was simply something she did the way she did things quietly, after sufficient consideration, with the full weight of her intention behind it. That evening she poured 3 cups of coffee. She did it without thinking about it, simply filling cups according to how many people were in the kitchen. 3 cups. She set them on the table and sat down. Stellan was at the table with his stones and his hawk theories and his gray eyes watching the world with the same careful attention with which his mother watched it. Bridget sat with her hands around her cup. The notebook was in Nora's coat pocket, and Cole would come, and the law was complicated, and the numbers were not in her favor, and none of that had changed. But the house had 3 people in it, and there was coffee for 3 cups, and outside the hawk that Stellan was tracking had returned to its circle above the valley riding the thermals, with the patient precision of something that knows exactly what it is and what it is doing and where it belongs. Nora looked at her son, and then at Bridget, and then at the cup in her own hand, and she thought about Clara Walsh's words and the notebook in her pocket and the long, quiet, subterranean process by which a person who has been surviving begins without quite deciding to do something more than that. Then she drank her coffee. And when Stellan began explaining with great seriousness the migratory patterns of winter hawks as they related to barometric pressure, Nora listened and Bridget asked questions, and the fire burned in the stove with a good steady heat, and the house held them all inside its walls against the coming night, the way a house does when it has people in it who are worth the holding. They came on a Thursday morning when the sky was the hard pale blue of deep winter, and the cold had settled into the kind of permanent declarative stillness that made every sound carry further than it should. Nora heard the horses before she saw them, two sets of hooves on the frozen road moving at the deliberate pace of men who are not in a hurry because they believe the outcome is already decided. She was at the woodpile when they came around the bend. She set down the axe with the unhurried motion of someone who has been expecting a thing and is not surprised to see it arrive. She did not go inside to get her coat. She stood in her shirt sleeves in the January cold and watched Harlan Cole and Deputy Orrin Doyle ride toward her house, and her face was the face she had worn through 2 years of difficulty, still angular, giving nothing away. Bridget was in the kitchen. She heard the horses too. She had been hearing them in her mind in some sense since the afternoon Nora came home from redemption with Clara Walsh's words and the particular set to her jaw that meant she had taken something in and was processing it below the level of speech. Bridget had been hearing them in the careful, alert way she heard all things that were coming toward her, with the part of her that had been trained by the past 2 years to treat the sound of approaching horses as information requiring immediate assessment. She looked out the kitchen window. She saw Cole on his fine horse and Doyle in his deputy's coat and the document that Cole was already drawing from his inside pocket before he had fully dismounted with the theatrical timing of a man who wants his entrance to land with maximum effect. She looked at these things. Then she looked at the cloth bag on the shelf, the one with the dried herbs, and at the small notebook-shaped absence in Nora's coat pocket where the book no longer was, and at the bundle under her bed that she had packed the night after Cole's first visit, the automatic preparation of someone who has always known that comfort is provisional and departure may be required without notice. She untied her apron. She hung it on the hook beside the stove. She went to the door. Cole had dismounted and was on the porch by the time she came out, which was not where he had expected her to be, and the small disruption of his expectation registered in the brief recalibration of his expression before the smooth professional surface reasserted itself. Doyle stayed on his horse. He had the look of a man performing a duty he had rehearsed rather than one he had chosen, and there was something in the set of his shoulders that was not entirely comfortable. "Mrs. Hargrove." Cole's voice carried the same oiled warmth it always carried, the warmth of a fire built specifically to make you stand too close to it. "I apologize for the intrusion on a cold morning." He held up the document, dark red wax seal, the kind meant to communicate the weight of institutional authority. "I'm afraid this is a matter that couldn't wait for better weather." Nora stood at the foot of the porch steps and looked at the document, and then at Cole's face in the measuring way she looked at things she was deciding about. "Read it," she said. Cole unfolded it with the practiced efficiency of a man who knows that the reading of such documents is itself a form of performance. The language was legal and complex and designed to be so a writ of recovery, citing an indenture contract, an outstanding debt, and the authority of the county court to compel compliance. It named Bridget Callahan specifically. It named Nora Hargrove as the party in unlawful possession of contracted labor. It named a sum that was, as Clara Walsh had predicted, considerably more than the assessed value of the Hargrove ranch. The options it offered were payment in full within 30 days or immediate surrender of the contracted party to her legal indenture holder, meaning Cole. Cole folded it again when he was done and held it out toward Nora as though offering something valuable. "I want you to understand," Cole said in the tone of a man being tremendously reasonable, "that I take no pleasure in this. The law is what it is. The debt is what it is. These are simply facts, Mrs. Hargrove, and I think you're a woman who respects facts." Stellan had come to the door of the house. Nora could see him without looking at him in the peripheral awareness that parents develop. He was standing in the doorway with his coat half on and his expression doing the thing it did when he was absorbing something serious. Very still, very attentive. "Stellan," Nora said quietly without turning. "Go inside." Stellan did not go inside. He took a step out onto the porch instead, and he reached out and found Bridget's hand, and he held it with both of his in the manner of someone making a structural decision about where they are going to be. Nora looked at her son's hands around Bridget's hand for a moment. Then she looked back at Cole. "The document," she said, "is fraudulent. The word landed in the cold air between them with a specificity that was different from argument or negotiation. It was a statement of fact delivered in the same register that Cole claimed to operate in, and its plainness moved across his face as a very brief disturbance before the surface smoothed again. "That's a serious accusation," Cole said. "It is," Nora agreed. Doyle shifted on his horse. He was looking at the document in Cole's hand with an expression that was doing more work than he probably intended the expression of a man who has been handed something to hold and has begun to wonder about its weight. Bridget stepped forward, not behind Nora, beside her. She moved to stand at Nora's left where she could see Cole and Doyle both clearly, and she did it with the same quiet purposefulness with which she moved through everything, not performing courage, not announcing herself, simply putting herself in the place where she needed to be. She looked at Deputy Doyle, not at Cole. She had assessed Cole already and understood him completely, and there was nothing further to be learned from looking at him. But Doyle was a different kind of problem, a man who was being used and who may or may not know it, who had the capacity to be either the instrument of an injustice or the means by which an injustice was stopped, depending on what he understood and when he understood it. "Deputy Doyle," she said. Her voice was even and clear and carried in the cold air without effort. "I would like to ask Mr. Cole to produce his ledger." Cole's smile remained entirely stable. "My ledger is a private business document and has no bearing on a court-issued writ." "It has every bearing," Bridget said, and something in her voice settled into a register of such complete certainty that it had the quality of something laid down rather than spoken. "The writ is dated the day of the auction. The final entry in Mr. Cole's ledger, the one that establishes the debt amount the writ is based on, was made after that date. I saw it when he showed the ledger to Mrs. Hargrove. The ink was fresh. The rest of the entries were months old." Doyle looked at Cole. It was a small movement, barely perceptible, but it carried a great deal of information. It was the movement of a man who has just been given a reason to look at something he had been not looking at, and who is now looking at it with the particular attention that comes with the specific possibility of having been made complicit in something. "Show him the ledger," Nora said. Cole's smile did not waver, but something behind it did, some internal mechanism arriving at a result he had not anticipated. He had anticipated argument. He had anticipated anger, the kind of blustering defiance that people offer when they know they are outgunned but cannot bring themselves to stand aside. He had not anticipated this, the flat, specific, evidentiary calm of a woman who had been watching and recording and preparing for this moment with the systematic thoroughness of her father's daughter. "I'm not in the habit of producing private documents on the demand of a contract worker," Cole said, and the smoothness of his voice had acquired for the first time a faint roughness at its edges, the way ice acquires roughness when the temperature begins to shift. "Then I can't act on this writ," Doyle said. The words came out of him with the quality of words that have been held back for some time and have finally found the pressure required to release them. He looked at Cole with the specific expression of a man drawing a line that he perhaps should have drawn earlier. "The writ requires me to verify the underlying claim," he said. "If there's a dispute about the ledger entry—" "There is no dispute," Cole said, and the warmth was going out of his voice now. Degree by degree, the fire cooling as the thing that had been feeding it was withdrawn. "The claim is documented. The writ is legal. Your job is to enforce it." "My job is to enforce legitimate legal instruments," Doyle said steadily, which cost him something visible, but not more than he was willing to pay. "Show me the ledger." The silence that followed had the specific quality that silences achieve when something real is at stake in them. Weighted directional, the kind of silence that is itself a form of action. Cole produced the ledger. He did it with the controlled deliberation of someone making a tactical decision, handing over the thing that cannot be withheld without the withholding becoming its own form of evidence. He opened it to the relevant page and held it out toward Doyle, and his face was now doing something that was neither the warm professional mask nor the anger beneath it, but something in between, the face of a man running calculations on a situation that has departed from its anticipated trajectory. Doyle took the ledger, he looked at the page, he looked at the final entry, the column of figures that total the date. He looked at the entries above it, moving back through the pages with the deliberate attention of a man who has done enough paperwork in his life to know what paperwork looks like when it has been produced at different times by different pressures. He looked at the color of the ink. He looked at the angle of the pen strokes, which are a different angle when a man is writing in a hurry or with the particular internal state of someone constructing something rather than recording it. Then he looked at Bridget. "You have documentation," he said. It was not quite a question. She reached into the pocket of her dress and produced a small cloth-covered notebook. She held it out to him, and he took it, and she watched him open it with the same even undemonstrative attention she brought to everything, and she did not explain what was in it because explanation was not necessary. The notebook explained itself. Her father had taught her to record things clearly and completely, and she had done so, and clarity and completeness were doing their work now without any assistance from her. Doyle read. He read for longer than any of them had expected him to read, turning pages with the careful attention of a man building a picture from evidence rather than confirming one he already had. His horse stood patiently beneath him. The cold pressed in. Stellan held Bridget's hand and watched the deputy with his gray eyes and did not fidget. Then, before Doyle had finished reading, a sound came from the direction of the access road. A wagon, moving at a deliberate pace, not rushing but coming with purpose. Clara Walsh brought her wagon around the bend and pulled up at the gate of the property. She had seen Cole's horse on the road into the ranch and had followed at a distance, and she was not alone. 2 other ranchers from the valley stood with her in the wagon bed. Men who had their own histories with Cole's ledger and their own reasons for being present when the accounting finally came. They did not speak. They did not need to. They climbed down from the wagon and stood at the gate in the cold, and their presence was its own form of testimony, the kind that cannot be manufactured or forged. Cole saw them. For the first time, the calculation behind his eyes failed to produce a result he could use. The maths of the situation, 1 deputy, a fraudulent, rid a girl with a notebook, and now 3 witnesses with their own stories, had exceeded the parameters of what he had prepared for. Cole said, "Whatever that document purports to contain, be quiet," Doyle said. It was 2 words said quietly without heat, with only the specific authority of a man who has made a decision and is no longer interested in the arguments that were being offered before he made it. Cole was quiet. Doyle read to the end of the notebook. He closed it. He held it in his hand for a moment, looking at the cloth cover, and then he looked at Cole with the expression of a man who has found the thing he was hoping not to find and is now obliged to act on it. "The final ledger entry is dated 4 days after the auction," he said. "The debt amount in the writ is based on this entry, which means the writ was obtained on the basis of a fraudulent claim." He paused. "Additionally, this notebook documents 17 other transactions in which Mr. Cole has obtained legal instruments based on misrepresented or manufactured debt claims in 3 counties over a period of 4 years. He looked at Clara Walsh and the men standing with her at the gate. "And I believe there are people present who can speak to some of those transactions directly." Cole said nothing. His face, for the first time since Nora had known him by sight, was doing nothing at all. The warmth was gone and the professional smoothness was gone, and what was beneath them was simply a face. The face of a man who has built an entire structure of advantage and is watching it undergo a structural failure that cannot be reversed by charm or by waiting. "Harlan Cole," Doyle said, "I am placing you under arrest for fraud, forgery, and the obtaining of legal instruments under false pretenses." He looked at Cole steadily. "Step down from your horse." Cole did not move for a moment. He looked at Nora, and in that look, Nora saw calculation, assessment, and the particular cold anger of a man who has been defeated not by force or luck, but by the patient, systematic preparation of someone he had underestimated. He looked at Bridget, and what crossed his face when he looked at her was something that Nora marked and filed away because it was the look of a man who understands exactly what has been done to him and by whom. Then Cole dismounted. Doyle produced the restraints from his coat with the practiced efficiency of a man doing a job he has done before, and Cole submitted to them in the silence of a man choosing not to provide any more material that might be used against him, which was perhaps the most intelligent decision he had made all morning. Doyle looked at Nora. He looked at Bridget. "I'll need the notebook as evidence," he said to Bridget, "and a statement. When you're able." "Yes," she said. He looked at Nora. "I'm sorry this came to your property." He paused. "I should have—" He stopped. Whatever he should have done was a thought he chose not to complete aloud, but it was present in the stopping, and Nora nodded once, which was enough. Clara Walsh caught Nora's eye from the gate. She gave a single nod, not a greeting, but an acknowledgement. The kind that passes between people who have survived the same thing by different routes and have arrived at last at the same place. Then Doyle put Cole on his horse and rode away down the access road, and Clara Walsh and the two ranchers followed at a distance, their wagon rumbling on the frozen ground, and the sound of all of them diminished on the long road toward redemption, and then was gone. And the silence that replaced them was of a quality that none of the silences of the preceding weeks had been. It was finished. The word moved through Nora in the way that the end of a sustained effort moves through a person, not with elation, but with a kind of sudden structural emptiness. The feeling of a tension released so thoroughly that you become aware of how completely it had organized everything around itself. She stood at the foot of the porch steps and looked at the road where Cole and Doyle had been, and felt the cold and the quiet and the hard blue sky overhead, and let the ended thing be ended. Stellan released Bridget's hand. He looked up at her with the assessing eyes that were his mother's eyes, and then he went back inside, which was Stellan's way of indicating that the situation had resolved itself adequately, and he was returning to his prior activities. The door closed behind him with a small, ordinary sound. Nora turned. Bridget was standing where she had been standing at the edge of the porch. She was looking at the road too, but she was looking at it in a way that was different from Nora's looking. She was looking at it the way you look at something when you are checking that it is finished, and also simultaneously deciding what comes next. Nora saw her look at the bundle in her hand. She had not noticed when Bridget had picked it up. It must have been before she came outside, or in some moment Nora had not tracked, but Bridget had retrieved from under her bed the small bundle she had packed in the first week of her being here, the automatic preparation of someone for whom departure has been the only constant, the only thing that could always be trusted to eventually be required. She was holding it in both hands against her coat. She looked at it, then she looked at Nora. "I should go," she said. The words were quiet, and she said them with the same even composure she said most things. But beneath the evenness was something that Nora recognized because she had been living inside its equivalent for 2 years, the specific quality of a person who is saying a thing they have decided is true and necessary and are not going to argue with, even if some part of them is not entirely certain. "I've brought enough trouble to this house," she said. "The trouble is done now. You don't need—" She stopped. Whatever she was going to say about what Nora did or didn't need, she decided not to say it, because it was not information she had been given and was not hers to assume. "You've been more than fair," she said instead. "More than fair, and I am grateful." She said it simply, without the elaborate architecture of gratitude that people sometimes construct when they owe someone something they cannot repay. It was a statement clean and final, and she meant it fully. Nora looked at her. She looked at the bundle in those hands, and the set of that chin, and the particular quality of her stillness, which was the stillness of someone holding very still, because movement in any direction would cost something they could not afford. She looked at Bridget's feet in the boots she had oiled in the 3 in the morning dark and packed with wool fleece. At the dress the color of the winter sky made from the flannel she had left on the table without a word. At those hands around the bundle, the hands that had stitched her shirts and coaxed medicine into her son's fever-dry lips, and copied the evidence of a criminal enterprise into a small cloth notebook with the systematic patience of someone who believed that truth recorded accurately would eventually matter. She thought about 2 years of silence in this house, the weight of it, the specific quality of a silence that is not peace but its absence, a silence that has the shape of everything that is missing from it. She thought about 3 cups of coffee on the table, set down without thinking, the body knowing something before the mind is caught up. She thought about the rocking chair and what it would mean to stop looking at it as a wound. She thought about her son's hand slipping into Bridget's hand without preamble or negotiation, the way children reach for what they need before they've learned to question whether reaching is permitted. She thought about the questions Stellan had asked in his fever in the thin voice of a child who has been without something so long that he asked for it, in the only moment when the asking is beyond his control. Nora stepped forward. She reached out and took the bundle from Bridget's hands. She did it gently, without force or urgency, simply enclosing Bridget's hands in hers for a moment, and then lifting the bundle away, and she felt those hands stay where they were for a breath after the bundle was gone, as though the removing of it had left them uncertain of what they were supposed to be doing. She set the bundle down on the porch step. She looked at the door of the house. She looked at Bridget. "Stay," she said. One word said quietly with the full weight of a woman who uses words as she uses everything only when necessary, and then with her entire intention behind them. Bridget looked at her. She looked at the bundle on the step, and then at the door, and then at Nora again. And Nora watched something move across her face that was too complex and too private to be named a movement, of something that had been held very still for a very long time. The way water held in a cupped hand can be held perfectly still if you do not breathe, and then something makes you breathe. She looked at the door for a long moment. Then she walked past Nora. She went through the door and into the house, and Nora stood on the porch for a moment with the cold on her face and the bundle at her feet and the hard blue sky overhead. And she listened to the sound of Bridget's footsteps on the wooden floor inside, moving through the kitchen, moving into the main room. Then she heard it, the creak of the rocking chair, not the sound of something being moved or cleaned or regarded from a safe distance. The specific sound of the chair taking weight, the particular rhythm of the rockers on the wooden floor back and forth, slow and even, the sound of a chair being sat in by a person who intends to stay in it. Nora stood on the porch. She stood there for a while with the cold around her and the sound of that chair inside, and she breathed, and the breathing was easier than it had been in a very long time. Then she picked up the bundle from the step and brought it inside, and she set it on the kitchen shelf next to the flour tin. Not out of sight, not discarded, simply placed the history of a person who had always been ready to leave. Set down in a house where leaving was no longer the plan. She went into the main room. Bridget was in the rocking chair. Her back was straight, and her hands were in her lap, and the chair was moving in the slow, even rhythm it had held through years of evenings, and the fire in the hearth was throwing light across the room, in the particular way it threw light in the late afternoon of winter days, finding the gold in things and bringing it forward. She was not looking at Nora. She was looking at the fire, and her expression was the expression of someone doing something they had not expected to be, doing something that requires a moment of private adjustment before it can be fully inhabited. Stellan came in from the back room. He looked at Bridget in the rocking chair with the same comprehensive assessment he brought to all important things. He appeared to weigh what he saw against whatever internal framework he maintained for categorizing the world. Then he climbed up and settled into the chair beside her, fitting himself into the space between her and the armrest, the way small children fit themselves into spaces that are marginally too small for them, with the serene confidence that the space will accommodate them regardless. Bridget moved her arm. She made room. Stellan settled. He produced the white stone from his pocket, the good one, the river stone with the translucent center, and he held it up to catch the firelight and turned it in his fingers with the meditative attention of a person in the presence of something worth examining carefully. Nora stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the main room and looked at this. She looked at her son, who was 7 years old and had gray eyes and theories about hawk migration, in a private relationship with stones of significant quality, and who had reached for a hand without being taught that reaching was allowed. She looked at the girl in the rocking chair, who was 18 years old and had crossed an ocean and buried people on the way, and arrived in Wyoming at the end of someone else's auction, and had immediately, without fanfare or self-pity, begun to do what was necessary. Who had kept her son alive through a fever and a blizzard, and kept her own counsel and her own records, and who had stood beside her on a porch that morning and faced a man with a legal document and the weight of institutional authority, and had dismantled both with the patience and precision of someone who had been preparing for exactly this moment without knowing when it would come. She looked at the chair, at the worn smooth of the wood, at the small depression in the right armrest, where Elias's hand had rested evening after evening. The dust that had been there for 2 years was no longer on the arms. Somewhere in the past weeks it had been cleaned away, and Nora had not noticed the moment it happened, and it did not hurt to notice now. It was simply something that had changed quietly in the way that things change when they are ready to. She looked at all of it. Then she went to the hearth and added a log to the fire, feeding it with the careful attention of someone who wants the heat to last. The wood caught and the fire built, and the light in the room increased, and outside the winter afternoon was doing what winter afternoons in Wyoming do, turning the sky to colors that have no names, deep orange, giving way to purple, giving way to the first hard dark of evening, cold and clear and infinite. She pulled her chair to the hearth and sat down. The three of them were there in the firelight, and the room was warm, and outside the hawk that Stellan tracked was somewhere above the valley riding the cold thermals of the coming night, and the horses in the barn were fed and settled, and the woodpile was high, and the fires would last. Nobody said anything for a while. There was no need to say anything which was different from the silences that had lived in this house before, different in its quality, different in what it contained. Those silences had been the silences of absence of the specific shape of what was missing, pressing against the air. This silence was the silence of people who are together and do not require speech to confirm it. Stellan said eventually that he thought the hawk had found a nesting site in the rock formation on the North Ridge based on observed flight patterns over the past several weeks, and that this was significant because hawks of this type did not typically nest at this elevation in winter, unless the thermal conditions were unusually favorable, which suggested that the valley had a microclimate that warranted further investigation. Bridget said that her father had told her that certain birds chose their wintering grounds not just for warmth, but for the quality of the silence, because silence in the right register was a form of safety. Stellan considered this with great seriousness. Nora listened to both of them and said nothing because there was nothing she needed to add, and because the sound of the two of them in this room, the boy's careful theorizing and the girl's quiet, attentive responses, was something she wanted to simply receive for a moment without interrupting it with her own voice. She looked at the fire. She thought about Cole, who would answer for what he had done in whatever way the law arranged. She thought about Doyle, who had in the end chosen correctly. She thought about Clara Walsh and the men who had stood at the gate without being asked, and about the other families in the notebook, the 17 entries that documented the long reach of a man who had believed himself beyond consequence. She thought about all the things that could have gone differently. The auction where she had been looking at a cow when a voice cut through the cold. The long drive home through the silence. The morning she had risen at 3 a.m. to oil a pair of boots and had stood in the barn listening for the sound of a door. She thought about what it means to be useful, not just functional. The difference between a mechanism that runs and a house that is inhabited. Between surviving and something else, the word for which she had not used in a long time and did not use now but felt in the room in the firelight, in the sound of her son explaining hawk navigation to a girl from County Clare who listened as though it were the most important thing she had heard all day. Later, when Stellan had gone to bed, had gone without the usual negotiation, climbing the stairs with his stone in his hand and his hawk theories apparently resolved to his satisfaction, Nora made coffee. She made it the way she had been making it recently without thinking about the numbers, simply filling cups, according to how many people were in the kitchen. 3 cups. She set them on the table and sat down. Bridget came to the table. She sat across from Nora and wrapped her hands around the warmth of her cup. And for a while they were simply 2 people sitting in a kitchen in Wyoming in the winter of 1887, with a fire in the stove and the cold pressed against the windows, and the enormous quiet of the plains spreading out in every direction around the small warm fact of the house. My father used to say, Bridget said that a house is not the building. She was looking at her cup. She said it in the tone of someone not making a speech but thinking out loud, offering a thought because it is there, and the moment seems to be the right moment for it. Nora waited. He said a house is what happens between the people inside it. She paused. He meant our house in Clare, the one that was gone by the time I left. She looked up. But I think he meant it generally. Nora looked at her across the table. She looked at this young woman who was 18 years old and had crossed an ocean and buried people on the way and arrived in Wyoming in someone else's auction and had immediately, without fanfare or self-pity, begun to do what was necessary. Who had kept her son alive through a fever and a blizzard? Who had stood beside her that morning and dismantled a man's carefully constructed fraud with nothing more than a notebook and the arithmetic her father had taught her? Who was sitting in Elias's rocking chair tonight, not because she had claimed it or because she was replacing something, but because she had been asked to stay, and she had stayed, and the chair was there, and she was in it, and the house had received this the way a house receives the thing it has been waiting for. I think he was right, Nora said. Bridget looked at her. Nora looked back. Outside, the night was fully down, the stars coming out in the cold, clear sky, with the hard, specific brightness of stars in winter, each one precise and distant, and burning with the same indifferent constancy they had always burned with before everything that had happened, and after keeping their own time without reference to the small lives moving beneath them. The fire in the stove breathed in and out. The clock on the mantel measured the seconds in the quiet way it had always measured them, keeping time. The way time insists on being kept, regardless of what the people beneath its passage are doing or feeling or deciding. They drank their coffee. There was no need to fill the silence because the silence was already full of the fire and the clock and the sound of the house settling in the cold, and the fact of two people sitting at a table together in the particular way that people sit when they have stopped performing comfort and have simply arrived at it. After a while, Nora got up and put more wood on the fire. She banked it carefully enough to last through the cold hours of the early morning, the practiced attention of someone who has been keeping things going for a long time and has not stopped doing so, but who is doing it now in the knowledge that she is not doing it alone. She went to the door and checked the latch and looked out through the small window beside it, at the night, the snow blue-white under the stars, the dark line of the pines on the ridge, the barn solid and quiet in the cold, everything where it was supposed to be. She stood there for a moment. Behind her, she heard the sound of the rocking chair. Bridget had gone back to the hearth, and the sound of it was the sound the room had been waiting for without knowing. It was waiting the specific sound of that particular chair in that particular motion, the sound of an evening in a house where things have found their proper weight and come to rest. Nora stood at the window and listened to it. She had come to redemption for a cow in the late autumn of a year that had been nothing but the continuation of 2 years of managed grief, and she had come home with something she had not known she was looking for, because she had stopped looking for anything beyond the next necessary task, the next number in the column, the next load of wood to keep the cold from getting in. The cold was still out there. It would always be out there in Wyoming in the winter, pressing against the walls with its patient, indifferent insistence. The numbers would always be thin. The work would always be hard. The land would always demand more than it gave and take without apology and keep its own counsel about what it chose to return. But inside, the fire was burning, and in the morning she would pour 3 cups of coffee without thinking about it, because it had become the natural thing to do. The thing that matched the truth of how many people were in the house. And Stellan would come downstairs with his stones and his hawk theories, and Bridget would already have the bread started, and the day would begin in the ordinary way of days that have people in them who are worth beginning for. Nora Hargrove turned from the window. She looked at her house, at the fire in the chair, and the woman in it at the cup on the kitchen table, and the door of the room where her son was sleeping, at the walls that had been holding absence for 2 years. And were no longer holding it because the absence had been replaced by something that had weight and warmth in the particular quality of things that intend to remain. She looked at all of it for a moment in the way you look at something when you are deciding to let yourself have it, when you are giving yourself permission after a long time of permission seeming beside the point to receive what is there. Then she went to her chair by the fire and she sat down. The rocking chair moved in its slow, even rhythm beside her. The fire burned. The clock marked the seconds. And the house, which had been a wound for 2 years, which had organized itself around an absence so long that the absence had come to feel like a presence in its own right. The house settled into what it was now, what it had perhaps been waiting through all those quiet months to become again. Not empty, not merely functional, not the managed silence of a woman keeping herself going through arithmetic and necessity and the grim, adequate endurance of someone who has decided that endurance is sufficient. Something fuller than that, something that had 3 people in it and enough coffee for 3 cups, and a fire that was worth keeping, and a chair that was no longer a wound, but simply a chair in a house where the silence had changed its nature entirely, where it was no longer the silence of what was missing, but the silence of what was there, warm and particular and real present, in the way that only things which intend to stay are ever fully present.